Okay. So, hi everyone. In the last year, I got a really good microphone at my home office, so I used to mumble. And if I have to speak up, just tell me, please, that I have to shout, because it's I'm not used to that anymore. Okay, so hi, I'm Szabolcs. This is my pre-COVID hair. I work at IBM Cloud as a senior engineer. You can find me on Twitter with _nets, and I also affiliated with JSConf BP, CSS Conf Budapest, and partially of this meetup, the Frontend Budapest meetup. Without any further ado, yeah, no, not that, yeah. So JSConf Budapest is happening again. We postponed it second time so far. Let's hope that we don't do that again. So 2022, June 2 and 3rd. It's a really nice Thursday and Friday. We have speakers. Week we found our speakers, so we're going to announce them pretty soon. It will be really good. So, but let's get to back. What's the topic of today? So today I'm going to talk about CSS Container Queries. Bit of a history. What is it, and why is it took so long to actually bring it to you? There will be some examples on how to use it, some API and usage examples, then actual examples, real life examples, and use cases. What is it good for? And last, some availability information. That is it? Can you use it or not? Can I use it or not? Yeah. So history. Media queries. Who knows what are they? Right. That's pretty much everybody. Good. Back in the days when the original first iteration of CSS was formed, this idea was lingering on that it should be really good to do this, but it never became part of CSS level 1, and it was still just an idea. And then around 2010, a really good blog post on the Listapart came up with this title called Responsive Web Design. And this was pitching the idea that if you use different devices that has different size of displays, then your content has to somehow adapt to it. Because right now, back in the days when you opened the web page on your mobile phone, which was getting more and more regular, the user experience was horrible. So this term, that responsive web design, finally emerged. And this was in 2010. It was almost 12 years ago, 11 years ago. 2 years later, it became part of CSS level 3. So we actually can use it. So media queries became part of our lives if you're a web designer or web developer. And you could create content for different kind of viewports and different kind of devices. And it was amazing. Not so long. Shortly after it was announced and introduced, people started to say, okay, that's great. Now, can I apply to that element? No, you can't. Then it's anti-modular, because I have to think as a whole page and not a module, not a component, not a tiny bit of my page. I have to think of the whole page as a responsive thing. And people wanted to do this first part. They wanted to apply this to an element, because I created this component. I don't want to be depending on the whole display. I want to just depend on the container that I put inside it. So it led to hacks, polyfills, which is not good, because that eventually led to unofficial APIs. And if everybody is using unofficial APIs, they will be broken at some point when the official APIs are come along. So this was bad. And this idea came up. So we have the media query, which handles all the viewport. And what if you just do this with these containers, the little components? And this is basically the main difference between media queries and container queries. And this is a great image by Ahmad Shadid. He has a really good blog post on this. I will share you the links later. So this is what container queries will actually capable of do on web pages. But don't let us get ahead so fast, because back in the days when we started to contemplate that, okay, we have to do this, we have to tackle this issue, the idea was called element query. So the original idea for this was like, okay, you create some viewport query-like thing and you put it on an element, and then you can create different kind of CSS rules for that element. And this was pretty exciting. So everybody was like, yeah, let's do this because we want that. And everybody was so excited about this. And finally, in 2018, this gentleman called Philip Walton created a really good talk on container queries. And this was the shift that explained people, okay, this is not called element queries anymore, it is called container queries because it's not trivial. It's a really tough thing to do from the browser perspective. Let me explain why. Two things, infinite loops and breaking the cascade. And first, infinite loops. So let's say you're still talking about element scoped queries. So we are talking about element queries. Let's say you have two rules. One is the element which is 500 pixels wide. And the second one, let's say we apply it a element query that if it's 500 pixels wide, then it should be 499 pixels wide. So this led to contradicting rules. Which one should be true? Because if one is applied, then the second one kicks in, and again, and again. This is an infinite loop. This is one of the first problems that they found that this won't work. This cannot be done. The second one is breaking the cascade. So this is how roughly and really shortly CSS rendering works. You load the CSS and an HTML, parse it, creates the styles, that you calculate the styles, which is the cascade rules, which style depends on what, which styles is inherited from which one. So this is create the CSSOM. Then you start to paint layout, which means everything gets its actual dimension on the page. And then you paint the whole thing on the web page. Now, let's say, and let's just focus on these two first parts. So first we calculate the style, which meaning that if I have a rule which should be something and it has children which inherits some CSS rules from there and so on and so on. And then I try to calculate all the sizes according to those rules. But let's say we have these styles calculated, inherited default ruled by specificity, and then we start to create a layout. And we have these rules that if it's this big, it should be something different, like the previous slide I showed you. And the layout shift, the layout painting, starts to reapplying style. That, okay, but I painted this style and it turns out it's bigger, so what should I do? Then I have to go back and see, okay, then the style should be like another thing. And over and over and over. So this is basically breaking the cascade because these steps has to happen each one after another when one was completed, so that you cannot go back on this chain. First, you have to load the CSS, you have to calculate the style, calculate the layout, and then paint the thing. You cannot go back. This is, if you want to do something, a style that during the paint turns out it creates a different size, then you cannot go back and recalculate the style again. You can't do that. So this is the next different thing. This is the next impossible thing to do. So long story short, layout sizing called style recalculation, which cannot be done. And the solution was create context shifting. So instead of looking at the element and try to calculate all these things on the element, let's take a look at its container. So the term container queries were born. Instead of the element, we start to look at the context. We're going to create a containment context like block or the flex does. And we're going to do the same things as they do, because if you do that, you can sorry, looking for words. So if you start to thinking about containment context, you can say, okay, this cannot be bigger than a certain size. The content of the container cannot stretch out the rest of the container because you created a new context. And the other one is size containment. This is just the one I just talked about, okay? So when the children cannot affect the size of the container, yeah, and the containment context will contain the style of your rules. It's complicated, yeah, I know. Let's move over the API and usage because that's basically how it works. It's pretty easy. For the container, you create this context. And this is how it looks like. You create the containment types and you create the containment size constraint. This means I will create a containment context for layout and style, like the block is doing a layout context. And the size will tell you that inline size means it can grow in width. It cannot grow in width, it can grow in height, but in width it will be contained within the size limit. In the current implementation that is available today, only the inline size works. The block size doesn't yet, I think. And whoa, the next thing that you can do is do the actual container queries. And this is how it looks like. There is a new keyword in CSS called @container. It's like the @media for the viewport. @container, and you can use the same rules like you do for media queries. Now, these are the elements that inside the container. So you can set up containment for narrow content. You can set up for wide containment. You can create a different set of CSS rules. Basically, this is the same that you can do with viewports. And the amazing things here is, like, this is my container class, and this is my element class, and this is the rule set for the element within the container context. You cannot see the container style rule here. You cannot see the name of it. It's not .container. It's something else. This means the container and the element inside those has been completely separated. The elements are only controlled and set up by the containment context. So if you're thinking about components, you don't have to pass in the container element's class name or anything that I'm inside this .container thing, yes or no. You don't have to do that because CSS resolved that for you with the containment context. So this basically makes these little components, these little elements that you create free from its containment context. You can finally think inside components like you do in React and everywhere, but without using any elaborate CSS context ruling and passing along class names and everything. You just rely on the containment context. And this is great. Containment contexts can be embedded into each other. So a containment context can contain another containment context and so forth and so forth. The element only will resolve to the next parent containment context. It's similar to stacking context. If you remember that if you create a element that is positioned relative and you put inside the element that is positioned absolute, it will be positioned relative to the relative element, which is creating the containment context. Creating the stacking context is the same, basically, but with containment, with sizes. So this is really good. Let's do a little demo. Here's this web page I just created like this week. Yeah, the titles and text may be familiar. The images are just random images from Unsplash. But here, so all that you see here is the same component, all of them. And their rules, their sizing is not defined by the viewport. It's defined on how wide containment they are in. So, for example, this one, can you see my cursor? No? Okay, yeah, you are sitting close, you can. For example, this one is rendering differently because it has the size to, spread its legs or wings or whatever. But if I try to move this a bit narrower, it changes the context, changes the size of the context immediately, and then it shifts, this part shifts for the same CSS that I used here before. And if I even go narrower, the typography here down gets smaller, so I can have more room for it. This is just a sandbox thing. And I can do this. This is where the media queries would kick in and reorder the whole grid for me. So I just say, okay, I am not talking about 2 or 3 grids, I'm just talking about things under after another. But then if I reorder the grid, the containment changes again and everything will be again full with sizes and it re-renders again. This is basically the code for it. There is some HTML here, doesn't matter. There is no JS, sorry. So there is nothing polyfills or wild APIs or mutation observers and everything in there. Basically what happens here is I have this article container class which creates the containment, and all the little articles like here are just wrapped around in there. And then down here I can create this whole context thing. So this first one is the hero mode, when the big one, the widest. And you see there's this article. So it doesn't contain the class name of its parent. It doesn't have to refer to it. It doesn't have to know about it. It just has to know about the containment context. The next one is the middle one. So if I go back, these are these two. And the third one is the narrow content, which is basically the bottom one. And it works. It's pretty nice. This is Chrome Canary, and you have to enable this. Sorry. Yeah. So you have to enable this flag, enable container queries on Chrome Canary, and you can try it out. You can play with it. And the last demo I want to show you before going back to my slides is this. So this is not using JS again. This is using container queries and pure CSS. This is amazing, guys. That was some examples and use cases. So let's see those. Okay, so you've seen all that. Let's move on. So first, pagination, yeah. I think we all saw this, that you have a component that contains page numbers, but if it gets narrower, it changes to this, and if it gets even narrower, you can change to this, and you can place this component anywhere on the page, and it will be used in a correct context with the proper size. It's really exciting to do the same with form elements. So for example, this can be a wide search bar, a slightly narrower search bar, or you can move this search bar and put it in a sidebar in your component or in a web application. And it's the same component. It's not using the viewport dimensions, and it's not using the viewport media queries. It's using only the containment context dimensions, and it creates a different kind of CSS for that. Alternating grids, like the grid sets the containment sizes and the viewport sets the grid layout, and you can mingle this all together and create really exciting, really useful, really nice examples like mine. And images. Images are a great example. I cannot show you anymore because I'm out of time during this week when I created this presentation. But think about aspect ratios, image sizes. What I could do is load different URLs from different sources of those images when I loaded the page before, and cut down on the downloaded image sizes, cut down on the bandwidth that I used, because my containers told the images that you don't have to use that big one image, you can load a smaller image. So this is really exciting. And availability, yeah, not that good. Right now, Chrome Canary with a flag enabled, you can use that, and that's it. But it's coming. The API might change. The API might be more verbose, but it's coming along. This is what Aniko was looking like this moment before. So you have to enable this, and you can try it out. And I will write these resources to the meetup page, and I will upload this presentation if you want that. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?